Evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Berkshire Ornithological Club. Before we get on to the main business of the evening, we've got a few announcements to make. The next meeting will be the photographic competition, and there's still time for you to enter your photographs. Friday will be the deadline, and the competition is in a fortnight's time, 3 categories: portrait, flight and action, and a new category, attention to detail. And there'll also be a prize for the best placed photo from someone who hasn't previously won a prize. So that should give some encouragement to everyone. I've entered some photos, so you can be sure that yours won't come last. Last time I came along with 2 boxes of books for sale in aid of the club's conservation fund. We've got some different books here at the front, so if you'd like to have a look at them at the interval or later, do so. The next outdoor meeting is going to be a walk at Little Marlow Gravel Pits. It's going to be led by Ray Reedman on the 10th of March, which I think is Thursday week. So contact him, see the club's website, and make contact with Ray to say that you're interested in going. And finally, a plea for help. You know, lots of people help the club in lots of different ways. We could do with some help with the technology here. Okay, we get set up, usually in the nick of time. There are notes written about how to set it up for different types of meeting, like if you have a remote speaker or the speaker here, how to connect it up to the sound system in the lecture hall. So it's all written down. It is a bit stressful when you've got everything else to do. So if there is someone who's a bit techie, who'd like to help us at the start of a meeting, that would be very much appreciated. So come up and speak to us later on. I'd just like to welcome those who haven't been on to one of these meetings before. It's good to see you tonight. The club it throws out a welcome to everyone who has an interest in birds, and we've got an excellent programme of indoor meetings through the autumn, winter and early spring, and also outdoor meetings that continue through the year. And the club is also very active with conservation, and as you can see at the front, we aim to produce an annual report. So let's have a look at see what recent sightings. What have people been seeing recently? So I can kick you off with pink-footed goose and white-fronted goose. They're still in the Padworth Lane area. Good numbers of red-crested pochard around Thiel and Burfield. A few Mediterranean gulls in the roosts. There are several firecrests around, including one that's been reported on a few occasions at Streatley. And yesterday there was an avocet at Thiel. So, anything else people have been seeing? Neil.
First singing blackcap of the year outside the County Goring Station yesterday morning. Don't know what I had to sing about the melody, so what was the singing?
Jolly good. That's the first singing blackcap of the year at Goring.
Yep.
There's still quite a few bramblings around. I'm seeing plenty of redwings, but not very many fieldfares at all. Okay. Well, let's get on to the main business of the evening. We have as our speaker Juliet Vickery. She's been a research scientist, but now she's the CEO of BTO. Her interest has been migratory birds and the challenges they experience as they are travelling across countries to their wintering grounds and back to their summering places. And for her talk tonight, she's focusing especially on the wood warbler, which is a favourite bird of many bird watchers. So I don't know whether Juliet realised when she was coming up with a title for her talk just how poignant it would be. But Juliet is going to talk to us tonight about the conservation of birds that migrate across borders and cultures. So please welcome Juliet Vickery.
Thanks very much, Robert, and Sally, and indeed all of you for inviting me along to speak this evening. Let me just kick off by doing the technology bit and getting my screen share up and running and make sure that that is working for everyone. So hopefully that will go. So I'm hoping that is looking fine. And if not, I'm hoping that Sally or Robert will tell me it's not looking fine. So it looks good to me. So thanks very much, as I say, for inviting me along, and also noticing from your earlier slides, congratulations on being 75 years old. That's a great achievement for an ornithological club, and you've got lots of exciting things obviously lined up for your 75th year. Sorry, I'm not with you in person in Reading. I'm actually in Dumfries and Galloway. I'm revisiting some streams I surveyed almost 35 years ago now as a PhD student, which is interesting in many ways, not least that my fitness of getting up and down the waterways now has definitely declined. However, let's not dwell on that one. I'm here to talk today about something that has really, as Robert said, inspired and interested me for over 30 years now, and that's migrant birds. And really kind of they grabbed me, as I say, 30 years ago when I first visited northeast Nigeria to look at where some of these birds were spending the winter. And of course, you know, it's something that's inspired many of us, I think, for decades as ornithologists. Perhaps some of it is to do with the sheer magnitude of the journeys that these birds make and the numbers of birds making them. And then I think also for the individual bird that makes that journey, what an extraordinary feat it is of endurance and navigation. And before I start my sort of talk proper, I'd like to share with you a little bit of writing actually from my local newspaper in Cambridgeshire, which focused on one of the BTO's satellite tagged cuckoos. It's a cuckoo called PJ, named after Pamela Joy, a very passionate bird watcher. And he has been carrying a satellite tag between the UK and Africa now for almost 6 years. The way that this journey was described, I think, just brings home just what an extraordinary journey it is for these birds twice a year. So this is what was written. He is one of the world's most frequent flyers who, despite COVID, has carried on clocking up the air miles untroubled by red lists, quarantine or travel restrictions. 2 weeks ago, he was in the Pyrenees, having left the UK in mid-July. His final destination is the tropical rainforest of Africa, where he will stay until next spring before his return to the British woodlands where he was born. In his path lies one of the most inhospitable places on earth, the Sahara Desert, 1,000 miles of blistering hot sand, which will take him 2 days to cross and force him to fly 3 miles high above the desert to seek cooler air. Many of his fellow travelers won't make it, but this is just part of the journey he has made twice a year for at least 6 years. So I don't know about you, but when I read that, it just makes me realize what an amazing thing this is. And I'm really pleased to report that I checked in today and PJ is now, having wintered in the Congo in the Ivory Coast. So he is making his way back. And, you know, that will be almost 60,000 miles that we have satellite tagged this individual bird over. So, of course, cuckoos are by no means alone in this, and we know that migration is a phenomenon that's shared by many birds crossing mountains and deserts and oceans, large-bodied birds like the osprey, but also small songbirds like this spotted flycatcher. Generally speaking, these birds make these journeys in 5 different flyways, and I've shown them here in 5 different colours across the globe. The Central Pacific flyway in purple, the American flyways. The one I'm going to focus on here is the central one, the Afro-Palearctic or African Eurasian flyway. But it's perhaps worth just reminding ourselves that not all birds just stick to these kind of global corridors. Some of them actually cross between flyways in even more extraordinary journeys. And just two examples. This is wheat ears breeding in Arctic Canada. So perhaps you can see my mouse, you might be able to see. So here is a bird that is bred in Canada and flies across the Atlantic Ocean into Africa. And of course, in the other direction from the Alaskan Canadian Arctic again to Africa. Extraordinary journeys for a tiny songbird to make. So crossing between these flyways. And then perhaps just returning back to our fantastic cuckoos. Here is a cuckoo that was actually tagged here in Beijing and has traveled right the way across pretty much half the globe, really, all the way across the top of India and down into Mozambique, where this bird wintered. Really extraordinary journeys. This bird is known as Flappy McFlappy. Many of you understand where that came from. And again, a sort of phenomenal example of the more you uncover, the more questions you begin to ask. But of course, we know that for many of these species, the completion of these extraordinary annual cycles is getting harder and harder. For example, in Britain, we know nightingales are declining by almost 56%, and this is all Breeding Bird Survey data. We know that birds like the windchat by 57%, and of course the turtle dove 95% in 25 years, really catastrophic declines of many of our migrant birds. This is true throughout Europe. This slide shows you just an index of bird populations. So the vertical line is just an index over time, in blue of all common birds monitored across Europe, and in red for long distance migrants. And you can see that those long distance migrants are constantly tracking at a lower number and declining faster than many of our resident birds. So it's true throughout Europe and not just in Britain, and it's been known about for a very long time. So back actually in 1974, when Stanley et al. Wrote a paper called "Where Have All the Whitethroats Gone?", when almost half the birds essentially failed to return to Britain in 1969. So we've known about it for a long time. The declines have been happening for a long time, and an awful lot of work has gone on to try and uncover and unravel what the problem is, and of course then to come up with solutions to that problem. But the sort of slight spoiler alert really to this talk is it's proving incredibly difficult to really pinpoint what the challenge is. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to home in on one bird, the Wood Warbler, and I'm going to talk about work that has been carried out largely by the RSPB. So for the moment, I'm putting back on my RSPB hat, which is my previous job. So work on the Wood Warbler in the breeding grounds, on the wintering grounds, and then reflect on what this is telling us about the problems for this bird and perhaps what we need to do next. So I need to really emphasize from the outset that this is probably about 10 years of research by an awful lot of people across 2 continents. But one particular scientist, the very brilliant John Millord, shown here in his kind of classic relaxed fieldwork style, has led a great deal of this work, both in Britain and also in sub-Saharan West Africa. And I just want to acknowledge that and say a huge thank you to him. So I joined the RSPB about 12 years ago, when already quite a lot of work had been taking place on the Wood Warbler on the breeding grounds. And this was the picture, if you like, perhaps when I joined, of what we knew about Wood Warbler. So a sustained decline, 32% since 1990. A bird that was now largely restricted to Western Atlantic oak woods. And as you will all know, a ground nesting bird, but a canopy feeder. So the 2 biggest contending factors, if you like, kind of ideas of what the problem might be, were an increase in predation or a reduction in prey over time that were having an impact on the ability of these birds to produce enough young to sustain their populations. And very luckily for the RSPB, there was a pre-existing study of wood warblers in Wales led by Tim Stowe. So we had two timescales in which to compare and ask, have we seen some changes? And if so, would those changes have accounted for the decline of wood warblers? So let's start first of all with increased predation. So the team set up a lot of nest cameras at wood warbler nests, which revealed a really extraordinary array of predators. So some that you will expect perhaps, so jay and magpie, which you can see. Others rather unsuspected, so the goshawk, buzzard, badger, and in the bottom right, You can't see it very well, but actually this is an adder here. So a whole array of predators, and actually very high predation rates are on these nests. And I'm going to show you a comparison of predation between the two time periods. So this simply gives you the proportion of nests that have failed at different stages in breeding in the 1980s in black and in the 2000s in hatched. And the take-home message really is twofold. First of all, the egg loss, the loss, particularly around chick predation, is very high. But this translates into an overall nest loss of around about 60%. And actually, that's sort of within what you expect for ground nesters, and it's pretty much in line with many other wood warbler studies. So high predation, but not unexpected. And then secondly, you can see, I think, that the dark bars and the hashed bars are pretty much the same. So really no sign of a dramatic change in nest predation between these two time periods. So if predation doesn't look like to be the factor, what about prey? Is there been a reduction in food, and is that causing these birds to rear fewer young? And when we talk about prey for wood warblers, we largely mean caterpillars. Again, the study could compare caterpillar abundance in the 1980s with the 2000s. And the results are mixed. So here you've got the mean caterpillar biomass for 4 different sites. Again, in black is the 1980s, and in orange is the 2000s. And you can see there's lots of variation. At one site, some sites they're going up over time, in other sites there's been a big decline. But overall, no real change in abundance of prey for wood warblers. Then what about timing? So many of you will know that there's concern that as climate change has an impact, we see insect populations emerging earlier and earlier in the year, and that maybe bird species simply can't keep track and keep up with that advancement. So the team also looked at this. So this now shows you the date of peak caterpillar biomass. So on the vertical axis is simply the mean date at which you get the highest biomass of caterpillars in relation to temperature. And you can see down here, I hope you can see my mouse, in 2011, where you've got warm May temperatures, your peak biomass of caterpillars is very early in the year. And where you've got colder temperatures in the 1983 and 1980s, your peak biomass of caterpillars is later in the year. So there is an effect of temperature on caterpillar biomass, and we do see that advancing over time. So this simply shows you now whether the wood warblers can keep track with this. So this is looking at wood warbler breeding. This is the proportion of nests that are started over different weeks in April for the 1980s in the hatch line and for the 2000s in the dark line. And you can see wood warblers are indeed advancing the first lay date of their clutches. But they're not advancing it enough. They're advancing by about 10 days, and we know caterpillars, the peak biomass advances by closer to 12 or 15. So they're not quite matching in terms of that peak food availability and peak food need, but it doesn't seem to have a very much effect on their ultimate breeding success. And that's because it turns out wood warblers aren't really very fussy eaters. And you can see that from this slide. So this is the amount of different sorts of prey in the diet of different of wood warblers in relation to how early they hatch. So these are early broods and these are late broods. So I'm just looking at Sally, and I want to check that you can see my mouse, Sally, when I move it on the screen. Can you give me a thumbs up?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, great. So I don't have to explain. That's perfect. So what this is showing you is that the early nests are indeed taking lots of caterpillars, but the later in the year you get, they simply switch to take things like spiders or flies or a range of other insects. So this allows this ability for these birds to switch their prey, allows them to be buffered against the effects of climate change advancing caterpillar. And overall, if you now look at how well they do, this now is the number of eggs, nestlings or fledglings. So this is a number of eggs, the number of fledgling, the number of chicks and the number of fledglings in the 1980s in black and the 2000s in red. And I think you can see essentially no difference in numbers of eggs, no difference in numbers of chicks, no difference in numbers fledged. So here we are, we've now essentially got 4 or 5 years in on a very intensive study on wood warblers, and there doesn't seem to be any signals of problems for these birds on the breeding grounds. So attention now turns to the birds' wintering grounds in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's the point at which a lot of this work fell to within my team and focused very much on the non-breeding habitats of wood warblers. Now, as you can imagine, working in a country with a very different culture, very different conditions is hard enough, but you have to actually find where wood warblers are in sub-Saharan West Africa, which is quite a challenge. So we knew a few things from ring recoveries, particularly garden warblers, but really very little. So essentially first find your bird. So it's perhaps worth saying a little bit about the background for those of you who aren't familiar with perhaps the kind of climate and also the vegetation in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is obviously the west coast of Africa. The yellow band is the Sahel. And it shows you, this is just to give you some location. This is Ghana and this is Burkina Faso. This is the Congo Basin here. This is Nigeria. And we ended up working largely in Ghana and Burkina Faso, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. But these longitudinal colour strips, if you like, are different vegetation zones. And essentially what they mirror is the rainfall pattern in sub-Saharan West Africa. So the green, perhaps as you probably imagine, are the wetter, more humid zones with good tree cover. The further north you go, the drier it becomes and the fewer trees you have in those landscapes. So these belts of different vegetation type. And to show what they look like, if you like, in real life. So obviously the top left is the humid rainforests on the Cape Coast. And then as you move north, you move into woodland savanna, Guinea savanna, and then the open Sahel. So as you can see, progressively drier, progressively fewer trees. And the intention was to essentially run a transect of point counts from the very north in the Sahel to the south on the coast. And the RSPB and the BTO joined forces to run these surveys. I'll come back to it in a moment. And here is where that transect was very broadly speaking run. So this is now Ghana and Burkina Faso. The dark green bands represent different vegetation zones. And you can see here we have 5 sites where we ran point counts, which run right the way from the coast to the north of the Sahel. And these are obviously the very dry zones, and these are the much wetter zones. The other thing, the advantage of this transect is it just goes through 2 countries, so politically much easier for us to work in. And perhaps worth saying just for the moment that when we started, we could indeed work in Burkina Faso. Now it's too dangerous for Northwest Europeans to work because of risk of kidnapping. So we now work with local Burkinabes who do the work for us, some very brilliant ornithologists in the very north. So these zones are important because we know that birds that winter in the different zones have shown different population declines or trends. And if I just flick back to this slide, this is just an index of populations over time. The open kites are arid zone species, so species that winter in the Sahel. And the closed symbols are humid zone species, so ones that move further south. And you can see that the arid zone species underwent this very big crash in the 1980s, which coincided with drought in the Sahel, and have now kind of remained stable, although not entirely. And the humid zone species have decided to decline a bit later. But of course, neither of them have recovered to their previous levels. So we know there are differences related to where these birds spend the winter. So there's the transect that we started. Having run this transect, the hope was we would find a site where we could study wood warblers in more detail. And that turned out to be a site in southern central Ghana, which was a humid zone site, which was kind of lucky for us in a way, because actually working in the Sahel, which is where this is it's pretty tough. It may sound like a wonderful way to spend your winter, to head off to sub-Saharan Africa to the sunshine, especially in the weather we've had recently, to do this field work. But I flicked back actually to one of my diaries, actually from 1993, when I was first out in northeast Nigeria, and this is the site that I was in. It's called Safari in northern Nigeria. And I thought I might just share with you what I wrote in my diary at the time. So some time ago, and this is all obviously very new to me. So this is what I wrote. So this is 29th of December, 1993, Safari in northern Nigeria. We have now made it to the most northern site, where the ferric red of ancient dunes meets the grey silty sand of lower ground. Camp is in a cluster of tamarinds in what was once a flooded hollow and is now baked hard, crazy paving. The usual 5 a.m. start, woken by the rhythmic sound of Fulani women pounding millet, the Betty go home calls of voracious doves, and the sound of Peter breaking sticks for the Kelly kettle to boil water for coffee. We crawl out from under our mozzie nets and clutch mugs of coffee, Nescafe flavoured with wood smoke, or a cup of tea which goes by the name of Beyond Comment. Then the 4 of us head off on our respective compass bearings for point count transects, increasingly hot hours of recording tree species, canopy shapes, and density of fruiting and flowering. All actually quite easy when there are so few trees in the landscape, of course. The birds were also very thin on the ground, mainly Isabelline and northern wheatears on open ground, 1 or 2 subalpine warblers, and some grey and chestnut-backed finchlarks, and a few grey-headed sparrows. By 9:30 a.m. it was time to retreat to the shade of the tamarins and spend time reading, transcribing data, sleeping, or extracting acacia thorns from our shoes. Until 4, and the heat is almost bearable for dusk transects. Ironically, one of the standard greetings out here, after someone asks you about your family, your goats, your chickens, and your crops, is, "How is the cold?" To which the response is, "One expects cold at this time of year." So you can imagine what we all felt when we were melting, when that was the general response. So that was what it was like to work in the very north. Perhaps luckily for us, wood warblers spent more of the winter in the more humid tropic zones, which were definitely much easier to work in and certainly much safer. So here was our site that we homed in on. It sits really where the forest begins to move into savanna. And it's a site called Pepiaze, where we spent in the end four winters studying these birds very intensively, using all the tools in the book to understand their ecology, the habitats they're using, and the way they forage. Since then, of course, we have known, we have tagged with small geolocators a number of wood warblers from Britain. So this is a wood warbler with a geolocator on its back here, which some of you might know operate by using light levels to track where birds go. And we know that we were broadly in the right place from this subsequent data. So here's a single migration of one wood warbler from Devon, in fact. You can see in July, it migrates actually down through Italy towards the Congo Basin, and then moves across to here is southern Burkina Faso and northern Ghana, moves further west to the Ivory Coast, and then back to the UK. So we didn't have this information, of course, when we started several years ago, but quite nice to see it now, and indeed, confirm, of course, what we were seeing. So here's the team we worked with in Burkina Faso and in Ghana. A lot of absolutely brilliant Ghanaian and Burkinabe field ornithologists. As I say, we threw everything at the book, really. So there's a combination of catching, colour ringing, point counts, radio tracking, and lots of habitat mapping to understand what these birds needed in Africa, and if what they needed had changed over time. Was that the problem? So this is a map of the site that we actually mapped using GPS. So let me explain what this is. This is just a schematic map of the study site, which shows you the main habitat types in this quite small area. And they're all color coded. And the real take home message is simply, it's extremely fragmented. There's a whole mixture of fallow, of forest, of arable, and of clearings. And this is the kind of habitat that we were finding wood warblers in. So sort of broken forest, mixed mosaics. So that's where we were mapping, and that allowed us over time to look at how this habitat was changing. So the question is, what within this mixture do wood warblers really home in on? And no surprise, they home in on the more wooded parts of this landscape, but not the most wooded. And that's what this graph shows. So this is the probability of occurrence. So how likely are you to find a wood warbler in relation to different sorts of tree cover, from very little, so this is percentage, to extremely high. And you can see that where you get the most wood warblers, where you're most likely to find them, is this intermediate cover of trees, around 40 to 65%. And that was important because what we found over time was that that cover of trees, that woodland, was disappearing. So here is the map of that site with just the woodland, if you like, shaded in 2012 when we started, and in 2014. And that represents a 26% loss of forest habitat in a very short period of time. Now, you would fully expect a loss of that sort of scale to translate into a decline of wood warblers, but that wasn't what we saw. Actually, wood warblers remained almost stable despite that big loss of forest. And when we looked at our data, we began to understand why. And that's because although forest was being transformed into either arable or fallow, many of the trees were left. So actually, although we've classified it as forest, in fact, tree cover was very good on other sites. So here you've got, within the open forest, about 110 trees per hectare. When it becomes arable, actually mainly what happens is that the ground is cleared and planted, but many trees are left for shade. So you can see quite high numbers in arable and quite high numbers in fallow. So despite that really big loss of forest, because many of these habitats retained trees, it remained pretty good for wood warblers. So at that scale, no apparent problem for wood warblers in their winter habitat. But of course, what you want to know is how representative is that site? What's happening across the whole of sub-Saharan Africa? Can we get at that? And the answer is yes, we can, using fantastic remote sense data. And that's what we did. So this is just obviously a sort of aerial shot, really, if you like, of that part of Africa. So again, just to give you some location, here's Burkina Faso and Ghana. The darker the green, the more forest. And what we did was we used the data we had from this one site in Ghana to say, what does that site look like from remote sensing? And then once we know what it looks like, we can essentially search that area and say how much of that habitat is present across the whole of sub-Saharan West Africa. And then you can use historical records and say, how has that changed? And that's what this graph shows. So this is, again, a map of Africa. Don't worry about any of the shading. Simply look at the dark black bars, which is the net change in the amount of suitable habitat for wood warblers. And what that shows you, I think you see very quickly, is in most of these countries, actually, we're seeing an increase in the habitat, suitable habitat, open forest for wood warblers. So what's going on there? That is not what any of us expected. And the answer, of course, is that it's because these dense tropical forests are increasingly becoming fragmented and degraded to open forest. And that's what wood warblers like. So at the moment, that degradation of tropical forest is certainly not a problem for wood warblers in Africa. Of course, it's going to be an enormous problem for many other species, and over time, an enormous problem for wood warblers. But right now, it doesn't seem like there's any signals coming from sub-Saharan Africa telling us there's a problem here in terms of habitats for wood warblers. So here we are now, 10 years down the line, after 5 years in the UK and 5 years in Africa, still unable actually to hone in on what the problem is for this species. And I'm going to break for 5 minutes there and come back afterwards and tell you what that, or hopefully what that means in terms of what we do next. But essentially you can see a fantastic mystery for us after all that hard work, both in the UK and in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm going to break for 5 minutes so people can stretch their legs and get a drink, and come back and pick it up from there and say, what does that mean for what we do next as conservation scientists?
When you're ready.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Great. So I kind of left you with a sort of, well, here we are 10 years down the line, essentially none the wiser as to what the real problem is for wood warblers. I'm a bit worried now, you all think I'm going to tell you the answer. And we still don't really know. There are two possibilities about why we haven't tracked down what the problem is. So the first is, as you can imagine, if you want to study a bird that's declining, you clearly need to go to somewhere where there's still decent numbers of that bird. So in Britain, it's studied, in this case, in Wales. They decline much more rapidly in Devon. It could be that if you look there, you might uncover something a bit more of an indicator of problem, but there aren't enough birds there to study them. So that's not really a possibility. The second area relates to the wintering grounds. We study them very much in the humid zone, but like many humid zone migrants, of course, they pass through the arid zone on their way north and on their way south. And that could also be a problem. They may not be able to fatten up sufficiently to get across the Sahara, for example, in that Sahelian zone. And the problem for us there is that it's now just too dangerous for many Northwest European scientists to work in northern Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, where those birds might stage. So it's very unlikely in the foreseeable future that that's a possibility. So we're left with a scenario where a bird that is declining, and probably also like many, for the same reasons as many other birds are declining on migration or through migration, without really knowing what to do. That's interesting. Now my slide doesn't seem to want to forward. Okay, let's try it this way. So we are looking into now trying to understand solutions for this wood warbler without perhaps knowing the entire problem. And that's a very different concept for many scientists like myself, where I've always felt very strongly you need to understand the problem before you can come up with the solutions. But I now feel, as many others do, that we cannot spend another 10 years trying to understand where the problem is. We need to start moving on our best hunches around what this bird needs. And for us in the wintering grounds, that means very much retaining trees in the landscape. So I showed you that for wood warblers at the site we studied, the reason why that bird we felt persisted, despite woodland being very much transformed, is because trees stayed in the landscape. So how can we look at solutions that work both for people and also for birds in sub-Saharan West Africa? And that's what we've been doing. I'm going to share with you too. So we have we have a PhD student now. I have a PhD student called Claire Bassell. She's shown here in the bottom left. She is working with local people in Ghana to understand why farmers do what they do with trees on their farmland, what encourages them to remove trees, to plant trees, to retain trees, and to understand if we can work through policy mechanisms to encourage that retention of trees. But we've also done some more practical work on two different options to retain trees in landscapes. One in the humid zone, which is on the right-hand side there, and one in the arid zone. I'm going to share a bit of about both of those solutions. So I'll start with the humid zone. So this relates to a forest called Gola Rainforest in Sierra Leone. It's a forest that I've done quite a lot of work in myself. It's very dear to my heart. And a lot of the work that we've done has begun to focus much more closely now, not so much on the wildlife in the forest, but on the people in the buffer zones around the forest. And the question there has been very much, how can we improve the livelihoods of local people to take pressure off the forest and to create landscapes in the buffer zone around it that also support a lot of wildlife. And that work with household questionnaires and community focus groups has come up with several things that these local communities really want to promote their own well-being, one of which is to improve the yield of cocoa in the forest zone. So we started with a development organisation to do a lot of work around rehabilitating and restoring old cocoa farms and improving the yield for existing cocoa farms. And here, as many of you know, is a cocoa pod in the edge of the forest. That's been very successful in terms of boosting the income for local families. So here's some very happy, as you can see, cocoa farmers with a much higher yield, a much better quality yield, and a guaranteed market for that. I love chocolate, but I'm not an expert, but I'm told Gola Rainforest chocolate is extremely good. This is a forest chocolate bar that you can buy in many of the RSPB shops now, with a great, as you can see, the catchphrase, eat chocolate, save a rainforest, which what's not to like about that, really. And that's been very successful in helping retain cocoa, particularly shade cocoa, with lots of trees around that cocoa that enhance the quality of the bean and the premium that you can charge. So that allows us, we know now, to retain a habitat in the buffer zone that's also really good for birds. So by keeping trees in that buffer zone, shading the cocoa, you achieve a better cocoa, a higher quality cocoa, and a better habitat for birds. And these are the kind of solutions we need to try and work on in many of the other areas of sub-Saharan West Africa. And then moving north to the Sahel zone, a similar approach to try and retain trees in the landscape. So here we focus on something called Shea butter. So this again is a map of sub-Saharan West Africa, and the green sort of belt there is the belt over which shea, the tree shea, grows natively. There are various pictures below of the shea tree, the nut, and the processing of that into shea butter, which is used in things like chocolate and also in cosmetics. And shea butter is extremely important as a source of income for some of the poorest women in these Sahelian villages. Now, the problem with shea butter now is that it's so prized that actually almost every other tree is removed in order to provide fuel wood to process shea butter. So you can see perhaps in the bottom left here, this is a shea parkland where the only tree really is shea. And what we now know is that shea needs insects to pollinate it. And if you remove all the other trees, you remove very important foraging and nesting habitat for the insects that are needed to pollinate shea. So the sort of focus of the work really was about demonstrating to local people that actually if you retain trees, you will also enhance your own shea production. And of course, those trees will also be really good for birds. So we did this by a number of experiments. So these experiments involve, you can perhaps see sort of bags on these shea flowers. This is one of our local workers putting bags over them. And what this does is exclude pollinators, and it helps to demonstrate to local people the importance of having these insect pollinators for their shea yield. And then by doing those experiments in areas which you have a lot of native trees, you can show just how important those native trees are to promote pollination. So that is now led to something called birds, bees and butter. So various almost agri-environment schemes in the Sahel and Burkina Faso. So here are various things that we've promoted to try to plant or retain trees, undisturbed land for bees that nest in the ground, in some cases even beekeeping, but various options that we hope will improve that landscape for insect pollinators, many of which will also improve it for birds. And that's just a side effect to try to help it work also for people. So what we know very clearly is that if we want to find solutions for birds like Wood Warbler and indeed the whitethroat, birds that we know require trees retained in that landscape, they will have to work for people as well as for birds. And that is very much the focus now in sub-Saharan Africa, to work with development organisations and try and find those so-called win-win solutions. And for us in Britain, I think this means we need to also think very hard about finding space in our very intensive agricultural landscapes for many of these migrants, which are also birds of agriculture. And of course, how we manage and look after our woodlands, again, to promote them as places where many of these migrant birds can return each spring to breed. And these will be really important elements of our work in Britain if we're going to welcome back every year beautiful birds like the Wood Warbler to our forests and farmlands. And I'm going to end there and very much welcome any questions. Thank you very much. So I hope I've stopped sharing now.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Juliet. Any questions? Any from the hall? Okay, well, maybe I'll kick off. I remember a talk here a few years back on the birds of Hampshire, and it featured wood warblers in the New Forest and their decline and how they were shrinking back to their core areas. But I also seem to remember that they suspected that the birds were actually moving north, and there were higher numbers were being found further north. Does that fit in with what you're finding?
So I'm not sure there's any evidence, as far as I know, for that. But what is very clear, as lots of you will know, is wood warblers, of course, are not site faithful. So it's quite hard to then, of course, tell the difference between a failure for a bird to return to the UK and simply a movement to another site. And that's one of the big problems, both in looking at survival. So if you can colouring individual birds, but you don't know if that bird returns or doesn't return, whether it's essentially perished or moved off. And the same is true of using these geolocator tags, which of course you have to retrap the bird to download the data. And because they again aren't site faithful, that makes that very challenging. So Robert, I'm not aware of evidence that they've moved north, but of course it's always possible that sites, because they're so scarce, haven't been found. But it's definitely true that because they're not site faithful, that adds the challenge of understanding if it's survival or movement on the breeding grounds.
Okay. Remington, I'll repeat his
question,
question.
There's somebody on the Zoom call wants to ask a question.
Sorry, fire away.
Could I ask a question, please?
Yes.
You were talking about measuring caterpillar biomass. Is that something that we should be doing as a local thing? And how do you measure? You were talking about not only caterpillars and so on, but when you were doing that, how did you actually do a caterpillar biomass measurement? And secondly, does it matter what caterpillars?
Yes, both very good questions. So I now need to caveat my answer. I think it is Mark that asked that question. With much of the breeding season data, of course, was done before I arrived at the RSPB. However, there are the main way which caterpillars are measured is by looking at frass from the trees, and people put out essentially traps to measure that density of frass, and that's your index of caterpillar abundance. There's a very brilliant scientist called Ken and Linda Smith, done a lot of work actually on woodpeckers as well, who've done some citizen science around caterpillar frass measurements and looking at timing of that. So if you want to know more, by all means, I can send you something, but if you Google Ken and Linda Smith, you'll find out some information about how to do that. So it's mainly around the frass, although you can also do trapping. And then for the diet, it's fecal samples. So people look at either insect mouth parts or remnants in fecal samples, and that's how you would measure the dietary content of these wood warblers. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Brenton.
Do you know the migration staging posts, fattening areas on migration?
Okay, the question here is, do we know the migration staging posts for wood warblers?
So the short answer is no, and the slightly longer answer around that is we worked, as I said, with two very brilliant Burkinabe ornithologists in the very north of Burkina Faso, a site called Orsi de Mer, which some of you may have heard of. Towards the end of our work with them, they started working a little bit earlier, and they started working a bit later in our winter. And they were picking up wood warblers on passage to a greater extent than we'd seen before. So it may well be that they do indeed stage in some of the drier areas further north, but we simply don't know, and it's incredibly difficult to get information from that part of the world. And compounded on that, just to think about the density of trees and the tree loss factor, is that the remote sensing information that we use is really good for dense forests. It can tell you if dense forests are shrinking or fragmenting. When you get into an area like the Sahel, where trees are quite scattered, it's very difficult to tell from satellite imagery whether you've got, if you like, 10 trees going to 5 trees. That's just not picked up. So looking at habitat change there is also problematic. But what we do know, of course, is that the very driest zone is, if you like, moving south. And one concern people have is it essentially makes the Sahara crossing longer. Because they're having to stage a little bit further south each time and make a longer crossing. But no, we don't. And because we have can only use geolocators, it means that we can only get data from birds that return. We've only got very small numbers of those birds to really look at what's going on. So, and that will be true for many of the small songbirds for quite a long time to come. And not a very conclusive answer, sorry.
May
Yes.
I ask a question?
Just a minute, Brenton, carry on.
Have there been any measurements of the fattening in southern Europe or North Africa? I'm not sure whether they've migrated from across the Mediterranean and Sahara together. But the fattening before they cross the Sahara, have we been out there and measured the fat levels?
Okay, so Renton is asking, have we been out to measure the fattening of these birds before they cross the Sahara?
No, it's a very simple answer, but no, we haven't, Renton. I mean, there is, of course, other work in other staging posts where people have looked at this for other species and tried to look at fattening. But I think wood warbler numbers are so small in these that there's just no information that I'm aware of. But it's something I haven't asked, in detail about. But I'm, pretty sure that we have almost nothing on them.
Okay. Sorry, there was another question.
Yes,
Margaret?
yes, it's me. I apologise, I missed half the meeting, so if that point has been covered, many apologies. I've read that a lot of normally migratory birds with global warming are being tempted to stay in this country. Could this be a factor at all, that they are not attempting to migrate and then getting caught out by a bitterly cold period like that we have just experienced, and in fact dying in this country without ever trying to migrate?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, Margaret. I think so not yet with the answer to that. I mean, of course, as you all know, blackcaps are one of the classic species that have started to spend winter in Britain. We've got a phenomenal number of swallows that have been recorded. I think 95 sightings on bird track in January of swallows in Britain, you know, essentially wintering Britain, which is completely unheard of, really. So there are definitely shifts. There's no sign of that for Wood Warbler. And actually what's interesting is that the perceived wisdom for swallows is it's also to do with the lack of these, the absence of these very, very cold snaps that have allowed things like swallows to stay and to feed largely on sandhoppers around the beaches, so just around the coast.
That's where they're feeding.
So that's a bit of a digression, but interesting around swallows, and as you all know about blackcaps, but there's no evidence for that yet. But obviously climate change will undoubtedly make life tougher for all of these species, and that I mentioned a minute ago about the Sahara essentially expanding in size will make that desert crossing even tougher, no question about that. And clearly we know that droughts in the Sahel have had a very major impact in the past on many of the migrant birds that breed in Europe. So if we see more extreme droughts, that will also have an impact. Hope that helps.
Yes.
Yeah. Is it possible that it's just a combination of factors that are all somewhat negative, all coming together at the same kind of time, and therefore making it very difficult to find any one individual thing that's the cause?
Okay, the question here is it possible that it's a combination of lots of factors, all with a negative effect, and not one in particular?
Yeah, I think that's extremely likely. And I think the line we use now is this thing called no regret solutions, which is about saying, if you like, all along the flyway, the job in hand is to do what we can wherever we are to, maintain the environment in as best a possible way we can for the natural world, which of course will include migrants. So I think that's exactly right. And a really nice example where we know this is the case, of course, is turtle dove, which, as we said, is 95% decline in 25 years, a bird that I also was involved in studying at the RSPB. We know that they're struggling in the UK because of a lack of weed seed and a lack of dense old hedges where they can nest. We know that they're being shot in unsustainable numbers, particularly in Spain on migration. And we know that they winter largely in the dry Sahel, which if it becomes drier, will also be a problem. So there's a bird that we perhaps can see that the impacts of more readily, and we know it's being essentially hit all the way along that flyway. And I'm not sure you asked that question, but I'm sure that's exactly the case. There are many things operating together, which is why it makes it so incredibly difficult to unpick the one key thing to address for a migrant. And perhaps now more of a realization amongst conservation scientists that we just need to get on with some of those things we know from the insights we have and some of our knowledge of natural history to try and do what we can.
Sean, you had a question.
My question is asked.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, just a final one from me then. If you're looking to see changes being made in Africa, is the only way to achieve that by appealing to people to improve their own life chances, the productivity of their farms? It's just that we had a talk earlier this year where from a similar part of Africa, and the speaker had set up a training course for local bird watchers in Africa, and that was having a lot of success, and he was training up young African scientists.
Yeah, so I think realistically, for the areas I'm talking about, these are desperately poor people. The only options around managing their land that are ever going to be sustainable have to work for them. I don't think that any amount of, if I'm honest, educational training or awareness raising around birds like the wood warbler will make a difference when people need to feed mouths and when people operate on the short term. So I think many of the options around it, people might have heard the Great Green Wall, which is an option to try and establish a green vegetation along the bottom of the Sahel to be more resilient to drought and climate change. They will also be great for many bird species. These are the things that need to happen for the people and to work for people in the first instance. So I think that we need to work, there needs to be much closer working with development. Before I left RSPB, we started conversations with development organisations, many of which are creating things like woodlots or field boundaries to, again, retain water and prevent a wind blow. And if you can alter the species of trees in some of these woodlots and some of these tree boundaries to be slightly better for birds and not be negative for people, maybe even positive, those are the kind of things you need to try and look for to help. So I feel very strongly that's the direction of travel. I think many of these things that raise awareness and interest will of course help. But when you're working with such poor communities, you have to find a solution that will benefit them too. So the shea butter is a beautiful example where you can show very clearly if they keep trees around their shea trees, they will benefit because more insects will lead to more shea butter. And those trees that you are maintaining because of their support insects will support birds. Those win-win solutions are terribly difficult to find, but they're what we need to try to seek. So that would be with apologies to your previous speaker, but that would be what I would suggest is where we have to go.
Okay.
Bruce
question.
Irvin, building on what you've just said, there is considerable success with a low technology scheme in Kenya, in some parts of Kenya, where they are building sand dams. The main objective of a sand dam is to provide clean, fresh water for a local community, but it goes way beyond that. It has a completely holistic impact on the people and the environment, whereby the biodiversity in the river areas is increasing dramatically. The water table is rising away from the water areas. Are you familiar with these sand dams?
Okay,
No.
the question from here is about sand dams, which have been very...
No, I haven't come across those. I mean, the main things I've looked at are traditional agriculture. So there are various forms of traditional agriculture that aid and development people are looking at, but I haven't come across those. So I should have a look at them. I don't know if they're also present in West Africa, but perhaps they are. And of course, the best way to spread things out is for people to see it working in action, by their neighbours, if you like. So thank you for that. I'll have a look.
Basically, you want to Google an organisation called Excellent.
Okay.
Excellent Sand Dams. And they're having remarkable success where they're set up. And you can see kind of before and after photographs that the woodland in particular is improving, and it's agricultural, it's water for the clean water for the local people, and it has so many knock-on effects that impact the environment. It's well worth having a look at that and seeing whether there are places in the Sahel that could benefit from this.
Great, thank you very much.
May I ask one more question?
Yes, far away.
With all this talk of regreening and efforts being made to put more tree paths in, as I sort of understand it, and again, apologies, I missed a lot of what you said, migratory paths are programmed into birds so that the babies follow them without ever having been. Is there any chance that they would modify their flight paths if huge green swathes appeared elsewhere?
Well, that's an interesting question with quite a complicated answer. So we know some birds do. We've seen actually a number of waders, and I can't remember the exact details of it, that have actually modified their migratory route where wetlands have been created, or yeah, where wetlands have been created. I think what's interesting about many of these songbirds is that what we do know from tagging is that a population in, let's say, in a part of Britain, when it migrates to Africa, will disperse over a very big area. So you will get birds from the same breeding population wintering across a vast expanse of Africa. And people feel that is an evolutionary approach to migration, if you like, that is a buffer. So in other words, in any given year, they will migrate in different directions. Some of them will encounter really good conditions and some will encounter not very good conditions. And those that encounter good conditions will be the ones that survive and come back. So you can imagine that if you start to modify the environment and perhaps create very good conditions in certain parts of that range, some birds will indeed be the ones that benefit. So maybe less about individuals changing behavior, but more about different parts of the population surviving better or breeding better. And that will how that modification will then occur over time.
Oh, that's great.
Fingers crossed.
Okay, well, in the absence of any more questions, I think we'll bring the evening to a close. I'd just like to thank Juliet for a very clear talk. I think it's become obvious just how many factors are involved in the survival of birds like wood warblers, and how difficult it is to understand which factors are the important ones in the bird's success or failure. So wish Juliet success with finally tracking down the calls for wood warblers. Those who are online, please unmute yourself, and we'll express our appreciation to Juliet in the usual way.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Happy birding.
Thank you.